I can't speak with this one in the back for all the time. It's a bit weird. Um, I feel that I was a little bit tricked by Elena, that I love deeply. We're supposed to have a conversation with somebody that unfortunately couldn't come last minute. And so Elena was like, just do a keynote. It's going to be super informal, just few friends. And now I found myself in front of 400 people at the Conservatorio, speaking the same day that also Prof. Schaumer spoke. That is somebody that I stole a lot from. So now, bear with me. We're going to try to go through this. When Elena asked me to come here and speak, she asked me, can you make a case for culture in Europe? Does it resonate? If you take where we are now in our contemporaneity and we take where we're going, does culture and creativity has a space in this moment? And when she asked me this question, I thought about one of my favorite speeches that I heard. In 1963, at the Harmless College, President Kennedy spoke in honor of the poet Robert Frost. And he said something that I believe is quite essential to get the point. He said, when power leads men towards arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations. When power narrows the areas of men's concerns, poetry reminds him of the richness of his existence. When power corrupts, poetry cleanses. As art establishes the basic human truth, which must serve as the touchstone of our judgment. So 1963 was a year of global uncertainty. The Cold War had pushed humanity into the brink just the year before. Civil rights movements were shaking the foundation of American society. Technology and social acceleration, from television to new cultural movement, were transforming how people experience the world. In that moment, JFK reminded everybody that art and poetry are not luxuries. They are the tools by which humans navigate uncertainty, preserve perspective, and imagine alternative. Culture stabilizes, orients, and expands the human capacity to act. A lesson probably even more urgent today than it was then. Because even if, in a more exasperated way than then, we are living in a moment, as we heard already many times, of polycrisis. From the climate crisis to the erosion of democracy, from the danger of AI to the specter of war. Our assumptions about economic, technology, and social cohesion are being challenged, and the coordinates of what we once knew has shifted. This is a global trend, but being in Italy, being Italian myself, and being European, I want to be mindful of my positionality. So I would like to focus particularly on Europe's current geopolitical challenges that are probably unprecedented since the post-Second World War period. In a recent article, a friend of many of us, Pierluigi Sacco, underlined that the rapid shift towards a new multipolar world order characterized by rising tension and fundamental questioning of the economic globalization that has shaped the recent decades is compelling our continent, Europe, to radically rethink its strategy and priorities. In this context, the role of soft power and culture in particular becomes strategically vital, yet it is this dimension that is currently being dangerously underestimated. I often feel that there is a deep human intuition about the value that culture and the arts play in our life. We feel it, we understand it, but we lack the language to share it. Especially, when we are in a boardroom, especially when we think about how to transform this feeling into strategic and institutional choices. So today I would like to share 3 main points that can help us building a bit of language, give maybe a little bit of perspective on the topic. The first one is realizing the era in which we live in. My provocation is that we live in the era of creativity. The second point is that culture is much more than a sector. It is an infrastructure of meaning. The third is that culture is what makes transformation possible. So, we live in the era of creativity. What does it mean we live in an era of creativity? If you think about it, in the last 70 years, we quickly moved from the era of information, where your competitive advantage as an individual, as a company, as an institution, as a country, was connected to how quickly you can have access to information compared to somebody else. Now, after information technology expanded, we moved to what UNESCO called the knowledge society. The accent was how quickly you're able to transform information into knowledge. Now we live in a moment in which we know that what we learned yesterday is obsolete tomorrow. There is a futurist that I love that is called Alvin Toffler, that already in the 70s were saying that the main capabilities of the future was connected to the capacity to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And these capacities underpinned specifically by creative skills. And so now the question is, how do we go about it? Now, I think that we live in the era of creativity, not because creativity is new by any measure possible, but because it has become structurally indispensable. One of the things that I sometimes love to showcase is the curve of innovation, of technological disruptive innovation in the last 3,000 years. The curve is basically flat for 2,930 years. And then the last 100 it's basically vertical. So now, of course, in this moment, in this specific moment, it's impossible to make prediction. The things is completely different. So in the era of creativity is defined by uncertainty. And in an uncertain world, linear prediction are no longer a reliable compass. What society needs are capabilities, not forecasts. Capabilities like imagination, meaning-making, collective memory, emotional resilience, and the ability to collect across differences. What before Professor Scheimer was talking about as the social soil. And these are precisely the capabilities that culture builds. A professor that I really like is called Ian Scone. In his book, Navigating Uncertainty, Radically Rethinking for a Turbulent World, argues that we cannot face this moment with incremental reform. We need radical rethinking. And the cultural field is one of the few places where such rethinking is actually possible, where norms can be questioned safely, where new narratives emerge, where visions of societies can be prototyped, where ambiguity is not feared but explored. Culture, in another way, is the R&D lab of societal imagination. And we understand that we cannot try to rethink a society without the disciplines whose job is precisely to rethink meaning. Navigating uncertainty requires drawing on a multiple form of knowledge: local, indigenous, historical, embodied, communal. Culture is the operating system where these knowledges meet, interact, and become visible. If uncertainty demands plural wisdom, then culture is the space where that wisdom is cultivated. Strong social fabrics, trust, networks, community bonds, and spaces of care rather than of control are key to work in this moment. This is exactly what cultural institution creates. Festival, libraries, museum, etc. These are not symbolic good. This is not a nice to have. These are infrastructure of resilience. Uncertainty carries a deep cost. It corrodes cohesion. It corrodes trust. It corrodes participation and well-being. Cultural participation actively restores those elements, increasing civic engagement, tolerance, pro-social behavior, and belonging. The challenges ahead are not linear I'm non-linear and interdependent. The skills we need the most, creativity, adaptability, inventiveness, are the very skills that culture developed at scale. The second point is that culture is more than a vertical market sector. It's an infrastructural meaning. We often speak of culture as a sector. I'm very guilty of this, as an industry, as an economic dimension. But culture is much more than that. Culture is the shared emotional operating system of society. It is how we learn to be human together. Yes, we can still make quite a strong economic case, though. In Europe, cultural and creative sectors employs nearly 9 million people. That is more the automotive alone. The case study are quite well known. Bilbao investment in the cultural space, the Guggenheim, and much more generate billions in tourism revenue over time. We're in Italy, our beloved Matera. The Italian will remember, some others don't, that now Matera is celebrated, is loved, and so on and so forth. Until not long ago, we remembered it was called the shame of Italy. And then through a very specific investment in its culture, it completely transformed the place. And we can go on. There are many, many of this. But we have to make two clarifications in this case. The first is that investing in culture and creativity must be done with responsibility and discernment, with a strong focus on avoiding new infrastructure of inequalities and exclusion. Second, the value of culture is not merely economic. We would fail ourselves if we would reduce culture to an asset class whose worth is measured only through economic KPIs. Because without culture, we can still build physical infrastructure, but no meaning. And in societies without meaning, fractures. As simple as that. The third thing is that history shows us that culture makes transformation possible. A couple of examples. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the challenges was not only political unification. It was a symbolic and emotional awakening. A whole society had to understand how to be together again. The role of literature, theater, film, museum, and memorials and conversation were central for people to process, to repair, to reimagine. It made possible the build of a new we. Another example that is very dear to me outside of Europe is South Africa. A dear friend, and constitutional lawyer, Luando Xazo, always says that there is a difference between regime change and transformation, because transformation requires the change and the transformation of the heart. During and after the apartheid, art was not decoration; it was part of liberation. All the arts that we know, from music to poetry, allow dignity to reappear before justice could. And even earlier, we tend to forget, in 1945, the world came together and decided to create UNESCO because they recognized the fact that culture is at the center of peace building. Now, in this contemporary, I think that we tend to forget this. It seems so obvious, but we tend to forget this. So, in this, we kind of go back to Europe. And so we established that Europe is going through a moment of deep transition. Now, the question is, what policy do we need to move forward? But a deeper question is, what stories are we telling about ourselves? Who are we becoming? Are we a fortress? Are we a museum of the past? Are we a laboratory of planetary imagination? To build a just, a sustainable, and human collective future, we need to strengthen our cultural ecosystem. We need new metaphor, new language, new narrative, new form of courage, new form of tenderness, new form of solidarity. And these do not emerge from economy alone. These emerge from culture. We face often a widespread misunderstanding. When we think about the past, we tend to think that creativity and imagination and the arts are often seen as product of few enlightened geniuses who, in isolation, generate the stories that move us forward. There's one Picasso. There's one Rothko. The one Frida, etc., etc. Impossible to recreate the Bauhaus. But what we know and what we need to really understand is that imagination is social and that creativity is deeply relational. They need spaces, they need contexts, they need the theaters, the libraries, the cultural centers, the studios, the community infrastructure where people come together to explore, question, rehearse, and reimagine. So, culture has been historically been Europe's most reliable problem-solving engine. And yet, one of the least structured one in terms of investment. So, we invest in energy, we invest in technology, but not in the infrastructure that help us forge meaning, build cohesion, and imagine the future. That should really make us question where we're going and how we're going forward. So in this context, we know that philanthropy alone cannot scale cultural infrastructure, and markets alone cannot protect its public value. So maybe we need more tools. Maybe impact investing can be one. Maybe that can help us to bridge what can grow cultural power without sacrificing its civic purpose. So culture, we understand, and in this moment, is essential to steer Europe's three biggest transitions. The sustainability transition, because no technological solution works without cultural shift in behavior and narrative. Professor Chalmers said this morning, without consciousness, there's no change. The AI transition, because defining meaning, ethics, and creativity is a cultural task. And the disruptive impact of AI can be softened by a dynamic and interconnected society. And three, democratic resilience, because trust, belonging, and social cohesion are cultural entities. Without cultural investment, our economic and political solution remains structurally incomplete. We are trying to fix a very complex world with only half of the toolbox. So, if we go back to what Kennedy told us in the beginning, he reminded us that art protects us from the arrogance, from the narrowness, from despair. Art keeps our humanity intact. He saw culture as a means of saving power from itself, a tool for navigating uncertainty, for preserving perspective, and for guiding action when the world feels unstable. And today, when fear is loud, when division is tempting, when uncertainty can become paralysis, we need culture to help us remain open in imagination, open in possibility, open in spirit. Investing in culture is not a luxury, it's not a nice to have. It is an investment in our capacity to transform. It is a commitment to the dignity of human being. It is transforming hope into a useful dream. It means doubling down of our humanity. Whenever society must transform, culture is the power that allows transformation to take root. Because if we cannot imagine a new world, we will certainly never build one. Thank you.